Okay, so let's start, and we're going to start this tonight's class again with another 3 minutes of um, meditation. So I will ring the bell to start and end. Greetings, everyone. As we just for the announcement, we are recording this, so everybody gets a fair notice of that. Just to very brief recap that I presented the questions of a little bit about how I came to translations and a brief outline of the three vehicles and the one vehicle as groups of teachings without going into too much detail. Today, I want to talk a little bit more about the three vehicles, but this time from the perspective of, excuse me, I didn't mean three vehicles per se. I meant three turnings of the wheel of the Dharma, where the first turning was for the vehicle, the two vehicles, the listener disciples and the Pratyeka Buddhas per se. And then the second turning was the great vehicle of emptiness and the Prajnaparamitas. And then the third turning was the one vehicle, great vehicle for suchness, primarily, and the manifestation of Buddha nature. So my personal introduction to this issue of one vehicle was done in the context of seeing its relationship with the Lankavatara Sutra. And so I want to, this is sort of like sharing my my surprise and what got me excited about this. Where are we? So this is Suzuki's, D.T. Suzuki's studies in the Lankavatara Sutra. And he where is it here? Okay, here it is. So he talks about, this is Suzuki talks about a teacher in China named Fa Chung, who was very much deploring that the study of the Lankavatara had been fallen into somewhat neglect after a couple generations after Bodhidharma. So he went around and he found some descendants of Huike that was still studying the sutra, and he put himself under their tutorship. And then he went out, he was given leave to go out and again lecture on the Lankavatara. Then, as he was going along, he actually met a monk who had been personally instructed by the second ancestor, Huike, in the teaching of the Lankavatara according to the interpretations of the Ekayana school of southern India. Now, I found that reference interesting, and it was also that same, it comes from the continuing biographies of eminent monks. And it's also referenced in a footnote in Philip Yampolsky's Platform Sutra, where he references this. So that was what got me most excited about, well, what is this? What does this mean that Bodhidharma was using the Lankavatara to seal his transmission, and this reference that the Lankavatara, that Huike and taught his disciples the Lankavatara according to the one vehicle school. And then after coming across that every time somebody mentioned in the Zen books like Wang Bo or Huineng in the Platform Sutra, who said the one vehicle is the vehicle for today, and others, every time the word one vehicle was mentioned in a Zen book, it popped out to me, and I go, oh, what's going on here? So the other issue related directly to the Srimala Sutra is that the Lankavatara mentions the Queen Srimala Sutra directly by name. One of the few times that one sutra will name an earlier sutra. And so most people and scholars and researchers, and myself included, come to a conclusion that this means the same community that resulted in the production of Queen Srimala Sutra was also the same community that resulted in the production of the Lankavatara Sutra, which does have that direct historical relationship with Bodhidharma and the Zen lineage. When the Buddhist Sutras came to China, there was they came in all different pieces in different order, historical order. So the Chinese did something that was not really carried out in India at the time, because in India, the sutras pretty much came out in an order that made sense to people. But in China, they didn't know what to make out of all the various Agama sutras, which is the Sanskrit word for what we call the Pali Canon suttas. And so there were the first schools in China were adapted from the Indian schools, a Yogacara school, a Madhyamaka school, a Vinaya school. But once they started trying to organize things, there developed in China schools related to a single sutra. The Huayan school, the Pure Land school was basically related to the Amitabha, 3 Amitabha sutras. The Tendai school was related primarily to the Lotus Sutra. And when they started having these schools develop based on sutras, each group put their sutra at the top, valorized it. So the Avatamsaka Sutra said, well, this was the most important sutra. It was the one given first, but it was beyond the reach of humans. So the Buddha gave this sutra in the land of the Devas, in the Deva world. And that's why, even though it came out much later, they argued that it was the first. And of course, the people who honored the Lotus Sutra said that was the king of sutras, and honored that as the foremost one. What's interesting to point out in relation to all this is that Zen and the Lankavatara never became the basis of a school. There was never a Lankavatara school, partly because of Zen's, with the 6th ancestor, the transition was from the focus from the Lankavatara, which was generally thought kind of too confusing or too elaborate, too complex, for the Diamond Sutra, which went directly to the Prajnaparamita question of emptiness as the threshold, door of liberation. One side effect or consequence of that is that the Lankavatara and the one vehicle didn't become emphasized at all in Chinese Buddhism as a school, particularly. Although all over the place it was recognized, and this is what I was saying, the comments of Zen masters and Tiantai masters and others all did acknowledge the one vehicle. And as I pointed out last week, we had that little three-tiered pagoda that the modern Zen master Chinese Dharma master put at the top of the pagoda, the one Buddha vehicle. One of my favorite Zen guys, Zongmi, Guifeng Zongmi, in the first half of the 9th century, writing between 825 and 840. He's the one I give the most credit to, and I think most other people do too, with establishing Zen as a lineage or school among the Chinese literati. He didn't establish it as a school, but he established the recognition of it as a school, because in his book, The Fountainhead of Chan, he described that anybody who can trace their lineage back to Bodhidharma is a valid and legitimate Zen tradition or Zen lineage. And that included the lineages that were offshoots of the 4th ancestor and the 5th ancestor, other than Wei Neng. So the Oxhead School and others. And interestingly, Zongmi wrote out that when in describing some of the schools, he listed 9. In describing some of them, they sound very New Agey from our point of view. One of them did not use Buddha statues and used rocks as sort of as statues. One did not use robes at all. And of course, the people who considered Orthodox Buddhism didn't like those things and would criticize them. But the curious thing of Zongmi, he critiqued them. He didn't criticize them. He critiqued them all as having a certain space within Buddhism and within Zen. And then what he did was a very fascinating thing, was he surveyed the Buddhist Sutras for what kinds of things they were teaching. And then he connected the different Zen lineages to an orientation within the Buddhist, the pantheon of Buddhist sutras and the Buddhist teaching. So this kind of while some of the teachers were, say, Zhi Yi, the main proponent or propagator of the Tiantai, he developed what they call the taxonomy of the sutras into 5, putting the Huayan Sutra as the 1st, the Lotus and Mahaparinirvana as the 5th, the Pali Canon as the 2nd, the sutras like Queen Srimala and others he put in as the 3rd, and the Prajnaparamita he put in as the 4th. This was sort of his version of a chronology of the sutras. But it's not really very accurate, because really the Prajnaparamita came out earlier. But what Zongmi did was he said, as we had that previous, the 3-tiered pagoda talked about the 5 vehicles in terms of the 5 kinds of people, humans and gods, the people of the 2 vehicles, and the people of the Bodhisattva vehicle. and then all together as one vehicle. Zongmi also did a 5-tier system where he put teachings of humans and devas as the first level. And in this, he included Taoism and Confucianism. Any system of moral or ethical value was what he called a teaching of humans and devas. And so that obviously was included within the Buddhist teaching as well. Zongmi's second layer or second level of importance was what he called the small vehicle, the Hinayana, according to the usage at the time. But he made it clear that this was not, was not something to be ignored or avoided. It's just you might call it the lower vehicle, lower than the floors that were built on top of it. So that's the sense that it's called small. And this is the teachings of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path specifically. Then he had what's called the Great Vehicle, Characteristics of Dharmas. And this is what we know as Yogacara today, the Fatsang school, Dharma Characteristics school. He said that was in the Great Vehicle, but because it focused on the existence, the reality of things, dharmas, he put that as a less profound teaching than the fourth or fifth teachings. And one thing to understand is that when we're talking about this teaching, this is what we would call Yogacara. There's a nuance there because there are different lineages of the Yogacara as well. And this is how there's confusion between when you're talking about Yogacara in Tibet and Yogacara in China. In China, they talk about old Yogacara and new Yogacara. In Tibet, they only talk about Yogacara, which is in the lineage of what is the new Yogacara. The three main lineage carriers after Asanga and his brother Vasubandhu was Paramartha, Sithramati, and Dharmapala. Now, Paramartha came to China in his lifetime. So there was not a legacy of his lineage of Vasubandhu left in India. And since it was not left in India anymore, it didn't get transferred to Tibet because that transfer didn't happen for another 300 years approximately. Because he left in the early 7th century, and it wasn't until the 10th and 11th centuries that Buddhism started migrating into Tibet. Sithramati wrote a lot of things. Some people think he might have even been the author of the Ratnagotra, which is the one Tathagata Garbha treatise in India. But it's a little unclear if it's the same guy because it's Siramati and Sithramati, whether they're the same person. Dhammapala is the guy, he was mainly a logician. And his school of Yogacara became the official Yogacara at Nalanda. It's the Nalanda University. His teacher, I mean, it went from Dharmapala, the lineage, to Silabhadra. And Silabhadra was the lead teacher at Nalanda when Xuanzang visited India in the early 7th century. No, excuse me, it would have been early 8th century, 700s. About 100 years after Paramartha. he learned Yogacara at Nalanda at that time from the teacher in the Dharmapala lineage. So when he came back to China, he said, everybody's got it wrong because you all got Yogacara from Paramartha, and everybody's got it wrong. And so that's why when his Yogacara was presented, it was called New Yogacara. But again, that's only in China because that's the only Yogacara they got in Tibet. So that's why this sort of division between old Yogacara and new Yogacara never happened. There are nuances of difference between them, and I won't go into the details except just to say that Paramartha's version was firmly acknowledging the one vehicle. And it was a Yogacara analysis of consciousness in the context of the one vehicle. And it had that orientation had specific ramifications for how they interpreted the Tri-Svabhava, the three own natures. Sometimes you'll see them just called the three natures, but it's really the three own natures. Or Svabha means one's own, or sometimes it's called self natures. The other lineage, the new Yogacara that Xuanzang came back with, had a different take on the three own natures because it wasn't the one vehicle. So it had a totally different balancing and weighing of the three and how the three reacted. So that in Xuanzang's version, the middle one, Paratantra Svabhava, was considered the most important aspect of things. Parikalpita is the wholly fabricated own nature. Paratantra is the dependent on another own nature. And the Parinispana is the fully complete own nature. Or that's the literal translation, and you'll usually see it called the ultimate self-nature, or the ultimate own nature. So the difference is the new Yogacara teaches that this dependency on others is fully realized just if you understand emptiness, and that the things that are dependent on each other are empty. But Paramarthas and the one vehicle said, no, you don't fully understand the three own natures until you fully realize the fully complete own nature, the ultimate own nature. And so that became the difference, which from our point of view is also a difference in the Zen aspect of Zen and Madhyamaka emptiness teachings. That Zen typically says we have to have our own realization of this. That's the phrase repeated over and over again in the Lankavatara. One's own realization that everything is a manifestation of mind. So with that little...
Do they use the word intuitively or known by a spontaneous sense? Because I've read some translations of other sutras that use that phrase.
Yeah, typically there's not a direct word for intuitive very often. The word prajna can be interpreted as intuitive wisdom, and the word jhana can be interpreted as the higher knowledge that one gains from realization and from study, both. So, and then in the sutra, in the one vehicle sutras, this comes up in the Queen Srimala Sutra. The word prajna is only mentioned once, where her parents say, "Oh, she has prajna," and I interpret that as intuitive insight. She has prajna, so she'll know what this Buddhist teaching means. Elsewhere, the terms for prajna and jhana are combined in a conjunction, a two-character phrase. And I translate that just with a footnote that it means knowledge of the kind that comes with study and realization, both.
Gregory?
Yeah.
Gregory. In the Lankavatara, at least the way that Red Pine, he calls it Buddha knowledge. What he calls Buddha knowledge, I've always translated in my own head as prajna, but it is what the Buddha knowledge, Buddha knowledge is the knowledge that he discovered, or the realization of emptiness. I assume they're the same thing. I mean, that's what, when he says that the Lankavatara, the only purpose of the Lankavatara is to get the Buddha knowledge and wake up to your true nature. Something like that.
Right.
Right.
But that's different than the phrase emptiness, to know that all things are empty. That's the Madhyamaka catchphrase. In the Lankavatara, the Lankavatara doesn't even use the phrase Buddha knowledge. It uses the phrase noble knowledge, the noble knowledge, Arya Jhana. But Suzuki says, they are essentially synonyms. But I like it better to say noble knowledge, because it detaches it from the personality of the Buddha and is about the knowledge that one has upon awakening, our degrees of realization.
Question about awakening or knowledge. It's not, as I understand it, in the one vehicle, the emphasis shifts from emptiness to suchness, to realization of
Right.
true mind, something like that.
Right. And so that's why I was going to go back to how Zongmi makes that exact distinction in his 4th and 5th levels of his 5 levels of profundity. And so the 4th level he calls the great vehicle destroying characteristics. And by that, he means the Madhyamaka emphasis, or the Prajnaparamita teaching of emptiness, signlessness, and wishlessness. That this, and Zongmi calls this destroying characteristics. But then his 5th level, he calls the one vehicle of manifesting the nature, manifesting your nature. And that's where they talk about the difference between that level of 2nd turning and 3rd turning. Because for the first 3 levels of Zongmi, it's what would be called the 1st turning of the wheel of the Dharma. The teachings of Prajnaparamita are considered the 2nd turning of the wheel, and the teachings of the one vehicle are considered the 3rd turning of the wheel. So
would that be the Samdhanimarjana?
yeah, they would. That's part of it. Yes, absolutely.
One thing that you said that I don't understand is that the Yogacara, maybe the old or the new, but I've heard you say this before, and I don't understand the criticism of it, that the Dharmas are real.
Yeah.
I mean, aren't they as real as what makes when Yogacara talks about Dharmas, what makes them real, and what makes when other people talk about Dharmas, unreal?
The Lankavatara and others are very, it's the duality aspect of it. The Lankavatara and others emphasize that we can't talk about them as existing or not existing. And the Yogacara talks about them as existing. And so that's the aspect of it that is.
But are they talking about, because, you know, in regular sense, people talk about existing. It's not that emptiness doesn't mean that it don't exist. It's just that it doesn't have a nature. So I'm wondering what kind of vocabulary are they using? Because in Zen, we say that emptiness doesn't mean that things don't exist. They exist in a normal way for everyday speech. And, you know, if I drop this, it makes a sound. And if it doesn't exist, maybe it shouldn't make a sound. So we say that it exists, but we don't mean that it has a separate being, you know. So what makes them say that when the Yogacara talk about being there, that they're talking about existence in the absolute sense? When we talk about existence, we don't necessarily talk about that we think it's actually a separate entity. So maybe it's a long answer, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. It has to do, of course, as I started off in the first thing about words and the relationship to words. The question of existing is really the fundamental point of how does it exist? We have appearances. Things appear. We can say that appearances exist because they're appearances.
Right.
But
yeah, excuse me, I'm going to have to take this.
When we talk about it, the question is, it's so easy to fall into this, that naming names a thing, and that the dharmas are discrete. Now, the Yogacara Abhidharma analysis broke everything down into 100 dharmas. And these 100 dharmas couldn't be broken down anymore. So it was an atomistic view of dharmas, not an emptiness view of dharmas. So that's how
yeah, you know, I wanted to...
Instead of a wave dharma duality.
Right. That's a modern way of saying it.
With love, Gregory, you might mute Danielle. He's kind of like echoing in the back.
I was trying to, and it wasn't working. There we go. Wait. Okay, got it.
CBN Cloud.
So just want to give a fascinating aspect of this, which is that when we talk about the turnings of the wheel of Dharma, the gods are involved. And I always find this fascinating in Buddhism, the devas, that the devas are involved. We know the story of Shakyamuni sitting under the Bodhi tree, and upon his awakening, wondering, what the heck am I going to do about this? How can I teach this? And the god Shakra comes to him and says, oh, you do need to share this and teach this. There are people who at different levels of understanding will be able to get it and be benefited by this teaching. So with that emphasis, with that spur, I call it the archetypal spur, the archetypal influence. The very first, the sutta that is recorded as being the first teaching that the Buddha gave to the 5 companions who had abandoned him when he started the middle way practice. That's called the Dhamma Chakra Pavatana Sutra, which means the sutra causing the turning of the Dharma wheel. And if you read the sutra, it's interesting. The very first thing that's taught is the middle way, not the four noble truths. The first thing is taught, the middle way is avoiding the two extremes of sensual pleasure and self-mortification. He had just, if you just remember, when he left the palace, he was giving up the attachment to sensual pleasures, or the extreme of sensual pleasures, where he had it all given to him. And then he went through the studies with the Srimala gurus that were the best known at that time in his area. And then he, with his 5 companions, turned to the asceticism practice, self-mortification. And his awakening to the middle way was when he realized that too was going too far in a direction, and there was something in the middle. And he says, to attend to reality and be awakened by the middle way. So that's the first teaching that is in the first turning sutra. And he says, this gives rise to seeing, which gives rise to knowledge, which leads to peace, to higher knowledge, to full awakening, and to nibbana, which is sometimes it's translated as unbinding, or sometimes it's translated as cessation. The reason I want to point this out is this is what it says. It gives rise to seeing, which gives rise to knowledge. In Queen Srimala Sutra, we see it over and over again, and it's also the big tagline in the Lotus Sutra, that the Buddha comes to the world to lead people to Buddha knowledge and Buddha knowing, knowledge, and seeing. So this combination of seeing and knowing, seeing and knowledge, is the tagline of the one vehicle that circles back to the very first sutta of the first turning of the wheel. After the middle way, Buddha talks about the Eightfold Path. He says that the Eightfold Path is the middle way. And then, only as the third teaching in that first sutta, does he talk about the Four Noble Truths. And that's the segue between of how you get from where we are to the Eightfold Path, the dukkha, origination of dukkha, cessation of dukkha, and the path to the cessation of dukkha. But I found it interesting as something not to note is that he only talked about those after he talked about the middle way and after he talked about the Eightfold Path. And then it comes to the thing that I wanted to say about this. It ends with, when the Blessed One had set the wheel of Dharma turning, the earth devas cried out, at Varanasi in the Deer Park, the Blessed One has caused the turning of the unexcelled wheel of Dharma that cannot be stopped by any shaman, shramana, Brahmin, Deva, Mara, priest, or anyone in the cosmos. So to me, that was very fascinating that, again, the Devas are there, and the Devas are remarking, this is the turning of the unexcelled wheel. The second turning comes about in the Prajnaparamita Sutras, which is the Prajnaparamitas and the earliest portions of the Lotus Sutra and perhaps the Avatamsaka Sutra came out in the 1st century of the Common Era. The Lotus and the Avatamsaka, though, were not completed until after the Prajnaparamitas sutras had made their big splash. Now, in the 25,000 lines sutra, Edward Conze translates it, and where it says, "A great many hundreds of thousands of devas called out with cries of joy upon hearing this Prajnaparamita teaching, hurling flowers and saying, 'Now indeed we see the second turning of the wheel of Dharma taking place in Jambudvipa.'" Jambudvipa is the name of this world realm that Shakyamuni Buddha was teaching in. So again, it's the devas that are there saying, this is the second turning of the wheel. But of course, because it's a Prajnaparamita Sutra, we have the formula for, like in the Diamond Sutra, the Dharma is not the Dharma, therefore it's the Dharma. So it goes on to a very similar thing. Buddha says, this is not, upon hearing the devas talk about it, he then turns to Subhuti and says, this is not the second turning of the wheel, nor the first, nor has the perfection of wisdom, the Prajnaparamita, been set up for the sake of turning forward any Dharma, or of turning it backward. Then Subhuti says, Bodhisattvas turn the wheel of Dharma, but they do not turn any Dharma forward or backward. And so we see that even in the Prajnaparamita Sutras, there is that recognition of the second turning of the wheel, and it has again to do with the devas there. Now the third turning, as Daniel said, is most clearly presented in the Samdhi Nirmokana Sutra. And so I'm going to just share this paragraph because it's a full paragraph. At that time, the Bodhisattva Paramartha Samudgata addressed the Buddha and said, in the country of Benares, at Rishpatana in the deer park, the world-honored one first turned the wheel of doctrine. Of course, the word there is dharma. This is Keenan's translation, and he translates the word dharma as doctrine. Teaching the four holy truths for those setting out in the word hearer's vehicle. That's the Shramana, the Shravakas. This turning of the wheel was marvelous and wonderful. Such as nobody, whether gods or men, had been able to turn in the world before. Nevertheless, there were superior teachings, for this first turning had to be interpreted and occasioned controversy. Then the world-honored one, with an underlying intent, turned the wheel for the second time for the sake of those setting out in the great vehicle, that all things have no essence, no arising, and no passing away, are originally quiescent, and are essentially in cessation. This turning of the wheel was marvelous and wonderful indeed. And of course, this is the thumbnail of the Prajnaparamita. Nevertheless, there were teachings superior to this, for it was also to be interpreted and occasioned controversy. The world-honored one then, with an explicit meaning for the third time, turned the wheel of doctrine for those setting out in all the vehicles. That all the vehicles is what is the meaning of the one vehicle. That all things have no essence, no rising, and no passing away, are originally quiescent and are essentially in cessation. So it doesn't contradict the second turning, but it includes the second turning, and it includes it in the sense that it applies to everybody, so that the second turning is no longer exclusive. This turning was the most marvelous and wonderful that had ever occurred in the world. It had no superior, nor did it contain any implicit meaning or occasion for controversy. Well, of course, that's what the sutra itself says, but of course it did occasion controversy because of its reference to being a superior teaching than the Prajnaparamita. There's a sutra of called the Sutra of Golden Splendor, or Golden Light, that talks about turning of the Dharma wheel with 3 phrases. It's not real clear that it is also a reference to the 3 turnings of the wheel of Dharma, although when Paramartha wrote a commentary on it, that's what he said that it was referring to. So the issue there is that this whole class of sutras, and I've listed those in the posted introductory section that I had on the blog. The main sutras of this 3rd turning of the one vehicle include the Lotus Sutra. The full title of that is, which hardly anybody ever remembers anymore, is the Sutra of the White Lotus of the Real Dharma. The Flower Garland, or Avatamsaka Sutra, the Sutra of the Samdhi Nirmakana Sutra, Queen Srimala Sutra, the Mahayana Parinirvana Sutra, the Sutra of Taking Up and Turning of the Great Drum, sometimes shortened to the Great Dharma Drum Sutra, the Sutra of Lankavatara, the Sutra of the Diamond Samadhi, the Sutra of the Root Karma of the Bodhisattva's Gem Necklace, the Non-Regressing Wheel Sutra, the Flower Garland Sutra, and the Shurangama Sutra. These are all sutras that explicitly state that the Buddha's teaching is the teaching of the one vehicle. And these are all sutras of that 3rd turning period. There's other sutras that aren't strictly they don't mention one vehicle, but they mention things that are very important to the one vehicle. One of them is called the Tathagata Garbha Sutra. One is called the Sutra of Not Increasing and Not Decreasing, and another is called the Sutra of Immeasurable Meanings. And I include Vimalakirti Sutra as a transition sutra that has one foot in the 2nd vehicle, emptiness teachings. But because Vimalakirti emphasizes non-duality in a manner that's actually over the didactic teaching of emptiness, I consider that the other foot in the one vehicle, because of the way the issues and items are presented in the Vimalakirti Sutra. So an example of the interconnectedness of this is, I'm going to share something from Wanchuk. And Wanchuk was a disciple of, well, let's see, he's a very fascinating guy, and we don't know enough about him. Or we, because he's not a Zen teacher per se, don't have him in our background very much. He first studied Yogacara in China. He was a Korean monk who went to China at a young age, around 20, and stayed there and wrote many things that were very impressive. And he was actually, based on his writings, he was given the abbotship by the Emperor of China of the Ximing, Ximing, Ximing Temple. So he's called Ximing Wanchuk. He wanted to be the king of Korea, one of the kingdom of Korea. I think it was the Shila kingdom at the time. Wanted him to come back, but the Chinese emperor wouldn't let him. He said, "No, you can't have him. He's too valuable to us." So his writings went back, and his writings made a big splash in Korea. And Chinul in Korea, who was a contemporary of the time of Dogen. He lived at the same time of Dogen. He's the one who's the main, just as Dogen brought Soto Zen to Japan, Chinul is the main person responsible for coalescing the Buddhist Zen Buddhism, Chan Buddhism in Korea as Son Buddhism. And the basic, we could say the three people that Chinul valued most in terms of commentary and teachings were Wanchuk, Zongmi, who I mentioned just earlier, and Da Hui, who's the main propagator of the koan tradition, and especially the Huado tactic within the koan tradition. So, so this is why just another connection. The Wanchuk connection is another connection between the one vehicle and Zen or Chan or Son Buddhism. In his commentary on the Samdi Nirmokana Sutra, which is the only complete commentary, even though Wanchuk made many commentaries, all but this one are remaining only in bits and pieces. This is his only full commentary of a sutra that remains. He has some treatises that are full, but in terms of his commentaries on sutras themselves, this is the only one that's a full one. And so the reason I bring this up is because in his commentary on the sutra, he cites Queen Srimala Sutra many times, and in one spot he says he cites the Huayan Sutra. No, excuse me. The I think it's the Mahaparinirvana Sutra. Yeah, the Nirvana Sutra. He cites a line from the Nirvana Sutra, which I found very interesting. He says, again, in fascicle 27, it says, the lion's roar is called the definitive statement. All sentient beings, without exception, possess the Buddha nature. So that's how the Mahaparinirvana Sutra defines the lion's roar. And this is the variation of the statement in the Avatamsaka Sutra, which is what the utterance that the Buddha said upon awakening, on seeing the morning star. This is a version of how to say it. All sentient beings, without exception, possess the Buddha nature. And the Nirvana Sutra acknowledges that this is the lion's roar. And the term lion's roar is used in two ways. It's used in the fundamental statements of the Buddha, and also it's used as the fundamental statements of any bodhisattva that presents the Buddha's teaching.
So Gregory, is that the lion's roar that all beings without exception have the Buddha nature? Is that the departure from the Prajnaparamita second turning?
Yes, because they didn't want to talk about Buddha nature. They didn't want to talk about Tathagata Garbha. They didn't want to talk about the Dharmakaya of the Tathagata in any way that would even remotely suggest it's a self.
Right. So that, from my experience with Zen, is central to Zen practice is the Buddha nature.
Right. And we're going to get in the Srimala Sutra. There's a section that is also shared by the same sutra, the Nirvana Sutra, that talks about the use of the word self as a paramita of the Dharmakaya. And this is how you find in Zen literature, the Chan masters and Zen teachers talking about realizing your true self, and why they're not afraid of using that word true self, because it's in the sutras, the word self is pointed to, that if we're talking about conditioned things there being the word dharmas, conditioned dharmas have no self. Have no
So,
self. But
can I-
the Dharmakaya can be pointed to by using the word self.
So am I correct in saying, when we're talking about awakening to Buddha nature or one's true self, we're talking the one vehicle Ekayana teaching. And when we're talking awakening to emptiness and the constellation around that, we're talking Prajnaparamita sutras.
That's right.
The second turning.
That's right.
Right, thank you.
So everybody's in all three turnings, everybody's talking about awakening. So, because that's Buddha. Buddha means the awakened one. And what Buddha teaches is awakening. So the three turnings are each a nuance about how awakening is framed and discussed. So that's why, again, I go back to that visual of the three-tiered pagoda as the one vehicle. The whole pagoda is awakening, and they're just talking about each level of teaching and discussing what awakening is. So
I thought it was the top is good and the bottom is bad. Did I get that wrong?
Is the Wymans or Waymans that they use the supramundane and the mundane?
Yes.
And so there would be the one vehicle and the Prajnaparamita, or I'm
yeah, okay,
I'm mixing metaphors that don't jive together.
right. It's a kind of category confusion, yeah.
Okay.
The Prajnaparamita also talks about supramundane versus mundane, because that's how the Buddha's teaching is distinguished from the teachings of other gurus. That
Okay.
yeah, it's not a mundane teaching. It's a super mundane teaching. And again, it's part of the Zen perspective is, first there is a mountain, then there is no mountain, then there is. First there's mountains and rivers, then no mountains and rivers, then there is. And so Zen always says we have to go through the emptiness. We have to go through the no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind. And I think that's how the Heart Sutra and the Diamond Sutra got pushed to the forefront, because it's really that sort of initiation threshold. But then Zen, like the one vehicle, emphasizes the appearances of things, not as things, but as appearances of suchness. And suchness is defined as the one mind of true suchness. So that's it's not just appearances that are empty. It's everything is an appearance of suchness, which is appears like a thing, absolutely appears like a thing, but they're more the emptiness teachings are more emphasis, like it always goes back to, but that's empty, but that's empty, but that's empty, and doesn't allow a two-sided approach that says that encourages people with the paramita of saying to practice and realize your true self. That's a paramita. It's an upaya. But it's also a way of pointing to how to cross over by crossing inward instead of crossing outward. And so that's why one of the features. Lastly, for now, I'm going to put on the screen a schematic of the hallmarks of the one vehicle. Then after this, I'll start talking specifically about Srimala. So here is the chief features of the one vehicle. This is my own survey and analysis. The one vehicle is the final third turning of the Dharma wheel. There's only 3, there's not 4. This is where you get a little bit of pushback from the Tibetans. They say the Tantras were the 4th turning. But in China, they always saw the Tantras as an auxiliary teaching of the 3rd turning, not as a separate 4th turning. The Ekayana, the one vehicle, can also be seen as the vehicle of oneness, the vehicle of unity, one mind, one dharma tatu, one flavor of liberation, one true suchness. So whenever you hear any of those kinds of phrases, one mind, one dharma tatu, one flavor of liberation, you know that this is it. We're in the land of the one vehicle, because this talk of oneness is the one vehicle. The Madhyamaka critique of that is oneness is too easily reified. But this is where we have to go back to the idea. It's the oneness that includes everything. And my little formula for that is 1 = 0 = infinity. So that we realize that we're not talking about a 1 in relation to 2, 3, 4. We're talking about 1 that, because there's only 1, we can also call it 0 because there's no other to it. But because it's 1 and 0, it is the if we want use another word, essence of everything, infinity, the universe. That's why we have the Buddha mind, the Buddha nature is the universe. Buddha is everything. 3, all vehicles are included within the one vehicle, which is not exclusive of any vehicle. So it's not the one vehicle is not an additional 4th vehicle to the first 3. The one vehicle is the vehicle that says all 3 are the Buddha's teaching for awakening. Tathagata as the unique, eternal, everlasting, quiescent, and unchangeable refuge is the ultimate refuge of the 3 refuges of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. This is something that, and on this list of things, not every single one of these is going to be found in every sutra. That's a one vehicle sutra. And not every one of these, I don't claim that every one of these is got to be there for it to be a one vehicle teaching or sutra. It's just that these are things that are common. So this Tathagata as the ultimate or true refuge of the 3 refuges is found in the Mahaparinirvana and in the Queen Srimala and in the Avatamsaka, whereas the Dharma as the ultimate refuge is in the first turning. And that's because they saw that the Buddha had entered parinirvana, had died and gone away. So there no longer was a living Buddha to take refuge in there was only the Dharma of the Buddha's collected teachings. And so this is how, in these turnings, the multiple turnings, that idea that the Buddha has gone away from the world was moved away from. And the idea of the eternal Buddha, the eternal Tathagata, became moved forward and came to fruition in this category of the third turning of the Dharma wheel. And you see that happens in the Lotus Sutra and all these same sutras I've mentioned, in terms of their recognition that the Tathagata is outside of space and time, but not dead, and still able to directly teach. And I again equate that with the idea, the modern idea of the Buddha archetype is always there. It's with us. We can't, it doesn't die. 5, the Dharma body of the Tathagata is the way of talking about the pristine, inconceivable, absolute suchness of reality. And again, the second turning sutras talk about emptiness, are in the conjunction in the triad of the 3 samadhis, or the 3 doors, gates of liberation: emptiness, silencelessness, and wishlessness. The one vehicles talk about the Dharma body, the Dharmakaya of the Tathagata. And so if you see the Dharmakaya emphasized, you know you're again in the land of the one vehicle. The inner Tathagata, or the Tathagata Garbha, is an expedient reference for the individual to connect with the universal Dharma body of the Tathagata. So it's said that you have the fetus, or the womb, or the interior sacred place of the Tathagata in each of us. And that is the synonym for just saying Buddha nature. We all have the nature of a Buddha within us. And this is the way of pointing to the Dharmakaya, but not that it's the universe that's outside of us, but that we can realize it by turning the light around. Buddhas manifest in order to lead and awaken beings to Buddha knowing and seeing. I mentioned that. The Tathagata Garbha simultaneously reveals both the emptiness of the mundane dharmas and the non-emptiness of the Buddha dharmas, inseparable from the Dharma body. This is a very, we might call it esoteric issue. I'm not going to talk about it much, except it became a very leading debate in Tibetan Buddhism between what they called self-emptiness, championed by Tsongkhapa, and other emptiness, championed by Sherep Dolpopa. And so you'll see that debate in many of the Tibetan literature. And Tsongkhapa won the debate as far as the institutional aspects of Tibetan Buddhism go historically, but only in the last maybe 50 years, in the last 70 to 50 years, the other emptiness is making a comeback, because the Gelugpa school basically hounded the Jopan school out of into underground status. But in the last 70 years, they've come out of the underground and are now talking about other emptiness. And this book, what turned me onto that was this book by Jeffrey Hopkins called The Mountain Doctrine, which is the great treatise of Sherep about his view of things. And he didn't know the word, he didn't emphasize the word one vehicle. What he emphasized was called the Great Middle Way. And he said that the Madhyamikans of Tibet didn't understand the Great Middle Way because they only had the regular middle way of emptiness. The Dharma body has these 4 guna paramitas: constancy or eternalism, ease, Sukha, Atman, self, and Subha, purity. And they're used as paramitas to point to the Dharmakaya. Samsara and nirvana are in relationship, that is identity with differentiation. The realm of beings, the Sattva Dhatu, is not separate from the Dharma realm, the Dharma Dhatu. The ultimate one vehicle is Anattara Samyak Sambodhi. Mind only, not consciousness only. We've talked about this in various ways. Or information only, which is my translation for Vijnapti Matra. Many translators don't distinguish between Vijnana Matra and Vijnapti Matra and call them both consciousness only, but there should be another term for Vijnapti Matra. Some people call it representation only. I call it information only because of the connotation of what we call modern information theory. I won't go into the details, but that is something that's to be distinguished. And if they're talking about consciousness only and not mind only, then it's an indication it's Yogacara and not one vehicle. Except in Tibet, because Tibet calls Yogacara mind only and doesn't acknowledge, under Tsongkhapa's analysis, they don't acknowledge the separate one, the different kind meaning of mind only. Original or natural form of mind, Sita Prakriti, Sita Prakriti. The natural or original form of mind illuminates everything, but becomes obscured by the stains, perfumes, and contrivances of the abiding state of ignorance. This is, we'll get to more about this in this section of the sutra that talks about this. But it's another distinguishing feature of how the one vehicle treats afflictions or stains or perfumes, vasana, klesa, how they treat these afflictions and where they come from and how to deal with them. Because of the abiding state of ignorance, we beings have lost our knowing and seeing by our true mind, and we become bound to the cycle of birth and death. So that's that. The 8 consciousnesses, 5 dharmas, 3 own beings, and 2 truths are each and all expedient teachings describing the same mindscape. Of course, that's my word, mindscape. And this is very prominent in the Lankavatara Sutra, that it shows how the 8 consciousnesses are connected to the 5 dharmas and are connected to the 3 own beings and the 2 truths. And that can even be portrayed in a schematic manner. Emptiness is an appropriate antithesis to the Abhidharma's thesis, but the tension between the 2 of them requires the synthesis of suchness as one's own Buddha nature manifested as the 3 bodies of the Buddha Tathagata. That's sort of a complex sentence, but it's talking about the 3 turnings, where the first turning is the Buddha's thesis. The second turning is an appropriate antithesis, saying that's right, but then there's this. And then the third turning is the synthesis that combines and includes both of those. All beings have access to awakening and enlightenment is only unattainable while the person willfully denies its attainability. This is a reference to the theory of the Ichantikas, who don't ever wake up. And this became this was a major dividing point between Xuanzang's new Yogacara and the early Yogacara and the one vehicle, because the one vehicle says, and in the Lankavatara it's also spelled out, that all beings can awaken, and there's only 2 kinds of beings who can't awaken or don't awaken. One is the person who willfully denies that awakening exists. As long as they're denying it, it's very hard for them to awaken. And then there's the bodhisattvas who voluntarily become ichantikas, or those who don't awaken for the sake of other beings. There's a nuance of argument about what that exactly means, but we won't discuss that. All Buddhist teachings are skillful means, upaya, and this, of course, was the big message of the One Vehicle Sutra, the Lotus Sutra. Enlightenment, it's like the finger pointing to the moon, and that's always been a very clear metaphor. These made more or less clear, unclear, definitive, or requiring interpretation, final or provisional. These are the kinds of things that become argued about, and I think this is probably the most critical part of the One Vehicle that I have, is that too many people who think they're talking about the One Vehicle fall into this idea that of definitive versus requiring interpretation, and argue about it. There's no point in arguing about it, but it's just a way of talking about the finger pointing to the moon, that ultimately the only thing that's definitive is the moon itself, not any of the fingers pointing to it. But you can say that there's some fingers that point directly to the moon, and some fingers that point to the reflection of the moon in the water. And so that's what is sort of being talked about when they talk about the clear teaching or the unclear teaching. The clear teaching points directly to the moon, and the unclear interpretive teaching points to the reflection of the moon in the water. Faith in Dharma is essential, but faith in Buddha as faith in the original natural mind is the most important. So we find this is how the Lotus Sutra is also the preeminent sutra for faith. And that's why people call it the King of Sutras, because it puts such a great emphasis on faith. But really all of them, and we'll see in Queen Srimala Sutra has the sections spelling out faith. That faith in the Buddha is one of the ways that defines the three categories of the children of the Buddha. All methods of practice are taught to stimulate awakening, which is a revolution or turning about at the basis or seat. The Sanskrit for this is the Asraya Paravirti of the natural mind, Sita Prakriti, also known as turning the light around, taking the backward step, etc. So this is another of the features that points out that Zen is in this tradition of the One Vehicle. All skillful means are for removing obstacles and afflictions that cover and obscure the one mind, the Buddha mind, the Dharma body of the Tathagata. And again, instead of saying the earlier vehicles talk about removing the afflictions to become liberated and an arhat. They don't talk about manifesting the nature, and that's the difference between that. In the One Vehicle teachings, when the obstacles and afflictions are removed, we manifest the nature. In the other ones, we enter the gate of liberation. It's a nuance. It's not, they don't oppose each other, but there's a nuance of one being more inclusive than the other. And this last one is the most important from my perspective. Differences in Buddhist teaching are to be resolved by synthesis and knowing the relativity of the causes and conditions being responded to that called for the teaching. This is one of the hallmarks of the One Vehicle, is that all the sutras are specific to the Buddha's audience and are the questioner. And there really is very little in the Buddhist sutras that is a universal teaching per se. We can see universal teachings in relationship to the audience that's being spoken to, but there's always the issue that if we see differences in the teachings, it's because of the audience that's being talked to, not not a contradiction of the teaching itself. So that's the number one, in my mind, aspect to the one vehicle. So again, I went a little further than I expected and don't have a lot of time for questions and stuff, but that's where I'll stop here. And next time we'll get into the at least the first paragraph of the Queen Srimala Sutra. So any questions, comments, feedback?
I have just as you were talking about the Samdhanimochana Sutra, I'm familiar with Reb's
Right.
commentary on it.
In fact,
And
I forgot that was written by Reb and not, I thought I said earlier that it was Dan Tigan Layton. I misspoke, Reb Anderson.
It says here, one of the things that I noted here, says the first turning is an analytical conceptual approach teaching the 5 aggregates, the 8 dharus, the 4 noble truths, the 12 links of dependent origination, and so on. The second turning, the Buddha taught that everything, including the teachings, like in inherent existence, is unproduced and ceasing and natural in a state of nirvana. And the third one protects us from a dangerously narrow understanding of the second turning. I like that.
Right. That's good. That's why I called it a synthesis.
Right.
So that because if we fall too far on the one side, we don't get brought back into the fuller view of it.
And that's why that metaphor that you mentioned earlier, about mountains and rivers.
Oh, yeah.
The mountains are mountains and rivers are rivers at first. And then as we move on, mountains are not mountains and rivers are not rivers. And then mountains are mountains and rivers are rivers.
Right.
Yeah. It's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Anyone else? All right, we'll call it an evening. Thank you very much for participating, and let me give you a sneak preview of the first paragraph. Have you all looked at it? If not,
No. Eliminating all that.
It says, thus have I heard, one time the Buddha dwelled in the Jeta Grove of Anathapindika's garden in the land of Saravasi. At that time, though their faith in the Dharma overall had not yet been designated for very long, King Prasanajit and Queen Malika declared, Queen Srimala is our girl who benefits by acute intuitive knowing and is thoroughly clever and comprehends easily. If those who see the Buddha can certainly and quickly explicate the Dharma and are able to have no doubt in their mind, then at the proper time we should send a faithful dispatch to her, stating our intention. So that's what they sort of said, talking to each other. But then the next line is, the queen stated and declared, the time is now right. So again, it's the queen. So we see that this is in the first paragraph, the intimation of the importance of the woman's perspective, where the king is kind of going back and forth, and the queen just says the time is now right. And so then they send Srimala, their daughter, who is also a queen, because she married the king in the neighboring kingdom. And so that's where we're headed. What was that, Carol?
Sorry, I couldn't find my unmute button. I just said hooray for the women. I really, I treasure this rare bowing down to the feminine Buddha Dharma, feminine way in to it. Yeah.
Very good. So we'll talk more about the historical context for that, as well as getting into this first section of the translation next week.
Right.
Anyone else? Okay, then call it a night.